Today, we're talking to Keith Gordon. Keith is Executive Vice President and Chief Security Officer at CIBC. And he holds this broad responsibility because he oversees cybersecurity, fraud, physical security, technology risk management, business continuity, and disaster recovery. He has been implementing Fusion in 4 banks in his career, and he has some stories to share. Welcome to a new episode of Fusion Fireside. My name is Eward Driehuis. So Keith, you worked for numerous large banks in your long and illustrious career. So can you explain to me, because when you started out, like myself, I think there wasn't really a university course to become a CISO or even to do something in IT. So how did you roll into this space?
Yeah, definitely has been a fun journey for sure. And, I'm an interesting background, even myself, because I've got a marketing and math degree. So not even a technology-based academic background. But one of the things that I found early on, to your point, is we were just trying to figure out what some of this stuff meant. And many of my peers did have really deep technical backgrounds, but interestingly, they didn't know exactly how to build a strategy, and they didn't know how to go, quote unquote, sell it. So I kept getting put in those positions of doing the translation of this is the technical background of what's happening, but then put that in plain business language, right? So how do you tell the story about something very technical, especially about something brand new? Because when you and I both started, cybersecurity wasn't even a word. It was information security or, data security or application security or something like that. So it was really learning in the trenches. And, I was no different. I started out in the AppSec space and literally had to learn what some of these terms meant. What is a cross-site request forgery? We even came up with some of these names, but we were learning them on the fly, and just the journey of continuously learning was what I took throughout my career. I was never satisfied with just knowing what I've got and being satisfied with it. It was always taking that next step to go learn the next vertical within the space. And I was very fortunate in that my experience was able to bridge between what we now call cybersecurity and fraud and physical security, and then what we now call Fusion, which is more of an integrated way in which we're bringing all of those teams together to combat some of the attacks that we're seeing.
Yeah, interestingly, that's another one of those translation issues, isn't it? At its core is as someone explained it to me, like the inability of threat intelligence people, for example, and fraud prevention people to sometimes understand each other while they both have the best intentions at heart, just not speaking the same language always or using the same taxonomies, right? So it's another one of those translation problems, it seems. So is that why you focused on that so much in your career?
It's part of it for sure. But if you look at the ultimate goal of who each team is trying to protect, they do have a different outlook. So the fraud teams are primarily looking at the client, like an individual person. And what is that individual person? It could be a fraudster, could be an insider that's trying to commit some sort of fraud. But it's all about money. But on the cyber side, even if I go back 25 years ago, we really weren't even talking about dollars. We were talking about the risk of showing up in the papers, right? That was every year. That was part of my own personal development, a personal performance plan is don't show up in the papers. Right. So it's, but to your point, the bridge has been a really interesting dynamic in that I don't think either fraud or cyber teams thought that their worlds would ever collide.
Right.
But I do remember the first attack that we saw that was the blending of actually three different vertical activities. One, it started out as a DDoS. It was a really big DDoS. And what we found was they were directing a lot of the resources at the consumer site, right? Trying to get our focus on how do we mitigate the attack happening on our consumer site. Well, we then started to see some anomalous activity happening on our commercial site, where we also have transaction capability. But we also noticed there was no DDoS happening on our commercial site. So we started to investigate a little bit more. Again, these were the early days when we were really starting just to build those bridges, even between personal and commercial sites, but also cyber and fraud teams. So we got a hold of the commercial folks. We're like, so are you guys seeing any activity? They said, no DDoS, but we're seeing some weird transaction capability happening. So come to find out, it was the same threat actor targeting one area to try to get our focus in one area for mitigation.
Interesting.
The actual attack was happening over here, where they felt like they may have been in a better spot and where we were more vulnerable because our eyes were over here.
Interesting. So by introducing a lot of noise, they hoped they would drown out the real illicit activity.
Right. And again, this was 20 years ago. So this is not like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
This is a couple decades ago. So that was really sophisticated back in the day.
Yeah.
And that was one of the attacks in my mind that I go back to that sparked the idea of a fusion topic of I need to be talking to the fraud guys just as much as I need to be talking to the cyber guys. Yeah. Oh, and don't forget about the physical security guys too, because we've seen now multiple different types of attack scenarios that involve all three. So it's a fascinating journey that we've been through. And for us, at least, Fusion has been that one way in which we've integrated not only the intelligence, but also the incident response, and then the post-incident recovery.
Right. So that's part of that too. So has that had received a push from your side? Or was it more like the movement, the motions were already set and you're just stepping in to guide everything towards the right direction?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because if I go back, you mentioned I've been at multiple banks. So I'm now in my fourth bank. First three, they struggled with the concept because if you go back to organizational boundaries, fraud normally reported up through the business, cyber reported up through technology, and physical security reported up to multiple different places, but they were never the same. And AML reported up to risk. So you had these big behemoth organizations that weren't ready to integrate and become a single unit. But in my mind, that was always where I was headed. That was where I wanted to be because I saw the benefit in it. And my first conversation with CIBC, 5.5 years ago at this point now, my now boss, she was talking about the concept, but they didn't really know kind of how to go do it. And I can remember her saying, we haven't met anyone, one that has had the experience across those different verticals, but also really understands how to even go build a fusion model. So I knew I was in the right place and to go build something because that's kind of who I am as I'm a builder. And how do you make something much more mature, but still being tip of the spear? And that's kind of how this evolved to where I am today. They had the idea of it, but they didn't have it executed. So it's been a 5-year journey to get where we are today.
Right. Well, I reckon that would help, right? Because the motivation is already there, but they need a guide, so to speak, to guide them through the jungle with a machete, which I imagine implementing Fusion would sometimes feel like, right? It's not easy, or is it maybe?
Well, it's been a definite culture change because if you think about some of the things that we've centralized, so intelligence is one of those key factors that is the underlying fabric of Fusion. Mm-hmm. But as you know, intelligence teams sit all across multiple different places. But when we brought together fraud intelligence, physical security intelligence, obviously cyber intelligence, and starting to bring in things like risk, geopolitical intelligence, anti-money laundering intelligence, a lot of different spaces. We're trying to do it on their own. But now that we've got a centralized unit driving all of it, we're really seeing some of the power that can come from it. Yeah. Now, as you know, intelligence can just be really good information. But where we're driving to is, the whole shift left ideology of how do you move to something that's more predictive or proactive? Because then it becomes actionable. Intelligence after the fact, you're just kind of trying to run to go catch up to what just happened. Yeah. But if you can start to build the bridge between that attack that I was talking about earlier, of you're seeing indicators over here that may actually be driving an outcome over here. But if you've got intelligence behind the scenes showing the connection, then you can really get to be proactive and help drive a response that Fusion for us, we actually renamed it to be resilience and Fusion.
Interesting.
Right.
So why the name change?
Yeah. So what we looked at is incident response is just one thing. And we've centralized all of global incident management and response into this one team. So it doesn't matter if it's a hurricane, earthquake, tech outage, cyber attack, doesn't matter. I've got a single team that manages all the incidents. But again, that's after the fact. We also wanted to build the bridge between preparing for a bad day. So think about the traditional business continuity, disaster recovery, crisis management, and now what we've called operational resilience. How do you build in the fabric of preparing for those days? And then you've got intelligence that's sitting over here driving indicators that are looking for the behaviors that could determine a potential incident or attack. So when you bring those three things together, it becomes a really powerful tool for us not only to get ahead of the game when something may be coming, but then also a centralized way in which we are responding with a fabric underlying it, saying that we've built technology in place, like from a resilience standpoint, to air gap our data, right? Just looking at things and how do you prepare for that potential bad day, and knowing that we've got the technical solutions in place to help manage and mitigate the incident response.
Wow. So if I hear it correctly, so since Fusion has driven such a broad range of capabilities, like this is quite clear in this paradigm, it needs to be a CISO responsibility then, right? There's just pretty much no way around it. So where should people start? Because obviously you haven't started, I imagine, like, let's change everything to Fusion. You've started somewhere. What first steps worked for you?
Yeah, and interesting, you mentioned the title CISO. Well, in the new world that I live in, CISO wasn't even a big enough role for what I do. So they changed my title to Chief Security Officer, because now it's bigger than just information security. It's about the security of people, assets, technology, response, and incident, right? So it's this protection of the company,
right,
and any peril that we may be facing. But really some of the first hard things that we had to do we started out with intelligence because I knew that I wanted to start at the fabric and the foundation of what's going to drive the outcomes. And, I was in a privileged position because I could just say it like, guys, we're going to bring together all the intelligence teams. We're all going to operate together. Then we moved to incidents. And how do we drive a consistent way in which we are driving a response to an incident? And it was more about driving consistency and efficiency at first.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're seeing the benefits in the kind of the 24/7 or, follow the sun, whatever you want to call it, the model in which we are driving a consistent way globally on when either we have a bad day or a client has a bad day.
Yeah. So would you say now that you're doing this for the fourth time, right? And it's fair to say that Fusion has always been a very big part of what you do in order to drive the results of the companies where you worked. So how about some of the silos that have been mentioned by many people trying to address these issues and getting people to collaborate? It requires often their words as breaking down of the silos. Have you seen that at all? And if so, how did you handle that?
Yeah, sometimes you're not going to be able to break down the organizational silos, but you can break down the information sharing silos. And that was the driver behind 3 previous firms where organization wasn't going to change. But what we did do is we brought together the teams, the disparate teams, into a common ecosystem so that everyone was comfortable on what we're trying to accomplish, but then also they would be comfortable in sharing what they're seeing. And then ultimately, not just verbally sharing, but when you start to get the confidence and the trust to bring together the data, that's when you can throw analytics and now AI to sit on top of this new data, integrated data environment. And that's where we're now really seeing some of the power come.
Yeah, it's amazing. So would you think that 20 years ago, when you did it without those modern technology capabilities, was that harder to do? Or was it just a different time and we had less data, so no worries?
Well, it's all a time continuum. Because 20 years ago, and I can still remember the first conversations I had with my fraud and AML and physical security partners. And they were even a little bit cautious on talking. Like, I don't know what my bosses are going to say about this, but okay, let's talk. And then it went to, all right, we'll have a weekly meeting and we'll just talk about some of the incidents that we may be seeing. Right? So we weren't getting real-time intelligence, nor were we really moving to that left of real time, meaning getting proactive. But we were starting to open the doors to start to see that some of the attacks that we were seeing truly were cross-pillar. So it was an over time benefit that we started to see. And then moving towards where cyber became the first driver of sharing data into Fusion, right? Because we were accustomed to things like SIM, where, oh, I've got this data, I'm going to send it someplace to do some analysis.
Correct.
And then we started to look at fraud and how do we bring in this fraud data in this environment? Because how do you possibly think about bringing transaction data into an infrastructure environment?
Right.
And then we started to look at what are the key indicators that we needed to begin to share. And it became a trickle that then became a bit of a stream. And now it's a full integrated river of information.
Yeah.
But it's taken years and years and years for us to get to that point.
Yeah. I can totally understand that. Yeah. So now you're at this place, and I imagine, right, people listening to that might think, well, Keith really has it made. He's got it all worked out. I'm sure that you wake up every now and then in the morning and thinking to yourself, how in the devil am I going to address this? What are your worries today? Do you have a top 3 things that you want to tackle?
Well, the job's never done, for one. But I would say that the top things that I get concerned about are still concerned about. One is our third parties, because much like any other large bank, we have significant third party arrangements where either it's a true outsourcer where they're processing something on our behalf, or they are managing data on our behalf. And they may or may not have the same kind of budget that I have to put in the more sophisticated tools and capabilities to protect that. So third parties, in my mind, are probably the highest risk threat to our industry today.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out through what I call my third party risk management function is, how do I extend the 4 walls of the bank into our third parties from a controls, procedures, protection standpoint? Because I believe that's the biggest risk for us. Now, as you move to more of the personal side, the threats, obviously AI is unbelievably sophisticated. And not only have we detected, but we've also been able to mimic some of the attacks that we're seeing that involve really, really impressive uses of AI, both visual and voice.
Yeah.
But ultimately, where my primary concern is on kind of dollar loss is actually on scams. The actual end user, where I have little control over what they're going to do. And it seems like every week we're seeing another story where someone has been scammed into believing something and then lying to us about why they want to pull money out of the bank because they've been convinced to go do it by some threat actor.
Yeah.
Right. And, current liability laws by geographic location is different. But right now in North America, if a client freely goes out and takes money out and then gives it to somebody else, they're going to be liable for that loss as a scam.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we're seeing the numbers, the actual dollar losses from what even we know. And the numbers are bigger than even what we know. But the scam losses are as much or more than our fraud losses today, which is a definite pendulum swing than it was 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. And that's really interesting, because that means that the impact to society, and even though the scam is, let's say, channeled through you, like you said, there's no liability towards you, but it's still your customers, and probably you are the first one they're phoning up after they're being confronted with these terrible events, right? It still means that you're at the very heart of this change.
For sure. And unfortunately, we're having to make some of the transaction speed bumps harder for our clients, because we're now getting smarter at detecting when it may be a scam. And we're putting in those extra steps to try to mitigate that risk. And to your point, interestingly, our clients are now becoming sometimes angry at us, saying, you can't tell me I can't take my money out of the bank.
Yeah. True.
When we know for a fact that it's some sort of scam that they've been convinced of.
Yeah. And how do the marketing and the departments feel about this? Like a simplified version of the story is always friction needs to be zero, right, for them in order to keep business running. And there's a point to that.
Yeah, well, and I think for most banks, they look at 2 things. One, if it's a fraud loss, in many cases, that fraud loss is going to hit their bottom line. they hold the fraud loss plan. So they obviously want that number to go down. And from a scam standpoint, they're seeing clients leave banks after scams. One, because they say, well, you should have stopped me from doing it, even though in many cases we try, right? And then once the dollars are lost, then there's faith lost in their bank. Rightfully or wrongfully, it's the reality of what's happening today.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult and challenging time for banks to try to deal with clients that are in these types of situations.
Right. So in a sense, it becomes a brand and reputation issue rather than a bottom line issue, not on the fraud side, a brand and reputation issue on the scam side, whether it's warranted or not. That's right. How it's perceived by society.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And I think regardless of, obviously, I live in Europe, where the rules and regulation tend to work a little bit to the other side. Like there are some countries that do scam reimbursements, but whether that happens or not, the impact to brand and reputation is still there. You can't regulate your way around that, if you will. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Keith. So I know you've told me when I spoke to you in Charlotte the other week, you told me that you, and I saw with my own two eyes, that you actually work on bringing some of your wisdom to the next generation. So what's happening there?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I've always been a huge proponent of career development from my own team and even others that are around me. I always take time to mentor those that are still coming up in their careers. And knowing that you and I were in the generation, in some cases, we had to make our own way. But 20 years ago, I wrote out a plan on here's what I need to go do personally if I want to meet some of my goals. And my first goal, this is 25 years ago, was to be a CISO. Well, back then, there were few and far between, even with that title. But I knew that I had to personally walk through the journey of learning it all because I didn't feel like I could get to that level without actually having done it. And so in today's environment, many kids are able to go to university and study cybersecurity, but I still tell them, you're not going to make it there just by reading it in a book. You got to go do it. You physically have to go do these things because that's when you know it and you learn it. You don't just understand it. And, my own family is a great storyline around this too, because, both of our boys, they both got married. None of the four kids had any sort of background or degree in cyber or fraud or any kind of risk management. But now 3 out of the 4 are working at very large banks in cybersecurity. And now the 4th is trying to transition from healthcare into cybersecurity. And, their backgrounds range from nursing. One was a writer. That was their degree, was in writing. The other was healthcare management. And the other was in marketing communications. But what they all learned was that their differences in thought were really a key driver, and they could learn a lot of the individual skills or the technical skills that they may need to go do a job. But every single one of them has done that same journey of you get your foot in the door, you learn a little bit, and then you go move over here, you learn a little bit more, you step over here, and you continue to learn. And I think one of the things that I know I see in my own team is my own employees' concern with, well, I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm comfortable. Those are the kinds of folks that I look at them and I say, you need to go find a different job.
Yeah.
Let's come over here. You've been in cyber 10 years. Let's go take a 2-year stint in fraud or in Fusion.
Yeah.
Because I really want my team to have a multifaceted view on what the threat landscape does look like. And so we don't get too comfortable thinking, well, I know it, so we're good, or I'm good.
Yeah.
But you and I both know that to become a CISO today, you have to have that continuous learning, challenging the status quo, challenging the norm view, but also have a wide spectrum of understanding of how things actually work and having done them.
Yeah, exactly. It's this is really resonates with me a lot, but I'm also very happy that your kids take after their old man, if you will. That's it must be making you very proud.
Well, it makes for interesting dinner conversation. How about that?
There you go.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this conversation with Keith Gordon, go to www.threatfabric.com/Fusion Fireside to check out other episodes.